Well, I just want to stand back and look at why these provocations succeed and what the institutional basis is that allows the ruling class to get away with this sort of thing. I've been very impressed with this history by Larry Shoup especially of the general strike in San Francisco of 1901, where, of all things, the employers tried to break up the unions entirely. They'd brought in all their, quote, special police who were shooting workers down, and the leadership of the strike, Andrew Furuseth, the Viking, was able to hold off revenge. Even the Catholic Church, Pastor York, was saying, we can't turn our cheek. Right? There's no pacifist tradition that Jesus was prepared to whip the money changers. He was taking a prophetic position. Of course, you don't stand against evil. You work to destroy it. So, one way or another, the strike succeeded. And it was especially, from my point of view, interesting that the examiner came down hard for the strikers. The strikers had the support of the means of communication. And that, I think, is what I want to stress about the provocations, that they don't succeed unless the ruling class has the means of communication sufficiently under control that it can stampede people. Stampede the Palmerades. They got, of course, the Gompers to support them and whatnot. But one way or another, they have to have the ability to stampede people. Einstein was asked after the First World War, what was the technological triumph that's most struck him about the contemporary period? Was it what, the theory of relativity? No. It was the ability of the means of communication to turn a pacifist people overnight into flaming warriors by having simply these 2-minute people come out and give talks and whatnot. We had this Preparedness Day in July 1916. Wilson was running on a "I kept us out of war" campaign, right? And they did Sancta Lusitania. Did it succeed in mobilizing people? No, the people were still hostile to getting into war. Took Wilson then, of course, a couple of weeks after he got inaugurated to get us into war. That's another story. But one way or another, the ability of the press, that was the means of communication at this time, to do this sort of thing was decisive. When Marx was talking about taking 15, maybe 50 years for the working class to educate itself sufficiently, the working class, from 1850 to 1900, had its own press and could duke it out with the bourgeoisie at the level of press circulation. What happens then when you have capital massively invested in the means of communication? They're, of course, able to then simply outlaw the socialist appeal and in the early 20s, which had a mass circulation, right? It was a mass circulation newspaper. But the ability then to control the access to communication, I think, has been especially decisive in recent periods. When I look at people saying, vote for so-and-so because of the Supreme Court, I'm reminded of Eugene Debs and his confrontation with the Supreme Court. here in his speech, the one that he was arrested for sedition, he comments, I realize in speaking to you this afternoon there are certain limitations placed upon the right of free speech. I must be exceedingly careful, prudent as to what I say, and even more careful and prudent as to how I say it. I may not be able to say all I think, but I'm not going to say anything that I do not think. Much good it did him for such a luminary as Oliver Wendell Holmes, this great authority in the Supreme Court. You don't have an unlimited right of free speech. You can't say fire in a crowded theater. Yeah, Oliver, but the situation is exactly the opposite. The theater really was on fire. And Debs was outside telling people, don't go in. He was telling people the truth, life-saving truth. Much good it did him. Right? He had, well, of course, he was thrown in prison and ran from prison. But his speech was, of course, totally unacceptable to a socialist party of dentists, as Trotsky called them. What is Tom Mooney guilty of? I will tell you, I am familiar with his record. For years, he has been fighting bravely and without compromise the battles of the working class out on the Pacific coast. He refused to be bribed, and he could not be browbeaten. In spite of all attempts to intimidate him, he continued loyally in the service of the organized workers. And for this, he became a marked man, the henchman of the powerful and corrupt corporations. Concluding finally that he could not be bought or bribed or bullied, decided he must, therefore, be murdered. That is why Tom Mooney today is a life prisoner, and why he would have been hanged as a felon long ago, but for the worldwide protest of the working class. So Debs has said, I know Tom Mooney intimately, as if he were my own brother. He is an absolutely honest man. He had no more to do with the crime for which he was charged and for which he was convicted than I had. And if he ought to go to the gallows, so ought I. If he is guilty, every man who belongs to the labor organization or to the Socialist Party is likewise guilty. Tom Mooney was the chief representative of the working class they could not control. They own the railroads, they own the great industries. Remember his remark, Mr. Debs, do you think the government should own the railroads? And he said, well, that would be better than for the railroads to own the government. I was thinking of Sanders talking about the Wall Street regulating Congress rather than Congress regulating Wall Street. Debs, of course, mentions Wall Street. It's perfectly clear that he understands the nature of imperialism, of capitalism. And, of course, in particular, it has been charged that Lenin and Trotsky and the leaders of the revolution were treacherous, that they made a traitorous peace with Germany. Let us consider that proposition briefly. At the time of the revolution, Russia had been 3 years in the war. Under the Tsar, she had lost more than 4 million of her ill-clad, poorly equipped, half-starved soldiers, slain outright or disabled on the field of battle. She was absolutely bankrupt. Her soldiers were mainly without arms. This was what was bequeathed to the revolution by the Tsar and his regime. And for this condition, Lenin and Trotsky were not responsible, nor the Bolsheviki. For this appalling state of affairs, the Tsar and his rotten bureaucracy were solely responsible. When the Bolsheviki came to power and went through the archives, they found and exposed the secret treaties, the treaties that were made between the Tsar and the French government. the British government and the Italian government proposing, after the victory was achieved, to dismember the German Empire and destroy the Central Powers. Those treaties have never been denied nor repudiated. Very little has been said about them in the American press. I have a copy of these treaties showing that the purpose of the Allies is exactly the purpose of the Central Powers. And that is the conquest and spoliation of the weaker nations. That has always been the purpose of war. Well, when we come now to the questions facing us, especially the word fascism is thrown around, the institutional basis of it, however, if you look at the actual dynamics of the declining Weimar regime, the Nazis made no headway against the Socialist Party or the Communist Party, none to speak of. They had their own press. But the Nazis had the nationalist press. In particular, they had the press of Alfred Hugenberg. They made a kind of honorary delegate. But he had been building his empire and was the effective, the Rupert Murdoch of his time. So they had the ability then to bring out of the woodwork all of these apolitical middle class and whatnot forces. So, and of course Goebbels, as soon as the radio technology was developed, he wanted to put a radio in every German home to hear his speeches. Now, since the Kennedy assassination, and recall how the CIA issued this directive to their centers, anyone who questions the Warren Report will be called a conspiracy theorist, Directive 1035-960. So we will be able, then, drawing upon our Mockingbird connections, the fact that we have put 12 agents right in the New York Times. We control, then, the sources of information. So we'll manipulate the feeble egos of the population by threatening them to be called conspiracy theorists. Never talk about the evidence. Never get into that at all. Just say conspiracy theorist. That will put the tin hat, and it's largely worked. If I look at the communist organizations, how many of them have actually tried to penetrate this kind of obfuscation? One has to go to non-Marxists. Peter Dale Scott commented, he was telling Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky that he was going to turn towards the investigation of the murder of JFK. And they were horrified. Why, no, you mustn't do anything like that. It's a question of masses in motion. That's the only thing that has to do with politics. Yeah, but a party, from what is to be done on, has to take on all the struggles of the working class. We don't have a mechanical interpretation of how consciousness changes. The party has to win authority. And it wins authority by having an account. And a worker asking, why was JFK assassinated? Well, JFK, we can give an account. Not by looking to the bourgeois newspapers, but by looking at what he said at the American University, looking at his policies. And people were lined up 6 deep to shoot at him, especially Hoover. Now we have this prayer sheet of Hoover that John Pepper has released in his book on the plot to kill Martin Luther King. JFK, MLK, and Bobby, right? The three desiderata on Hoover's prayer sheet. And we now have this evidence that bundles of cash marked to Reverend Billy Kyles and to Jesse Jackson were offered up by Clyde Tolson, the close comrade in arms of our fairy godfather. But all of this then depends on the massive investment of capital in the means of communication. And a phenomenon such as, well, the grotesque phenomenon of the American election season makes no sense apart from looking at the power of television, of the domination of the accessible means of communication by then the corporations. So along with this militarization, and note how the Posse Comitatus Act has, since you mentioned the 1877, withdrawing the troops from the South, reinstituted the whole conception of the sheriff, the reeve of the shire, right? The shire reeve is the one with the monopoly on the legitimate use of force. No one is higher than the sheriff in actually carrying out violence required for law and order. That has simply been abrogated, right? Northcom sent forces to Cleveland. They were prepared to use the military, as well as, of course, having militarized the police. They can use soldiers against us now. Why is that? Well, they are preparing that they know very well that capitalism no longer regulates the metabolism of man with nature. It's going down. And they are preparing in their inimitable way to turn it into a question of force. So that's about all I can leave us with. I'd like to leave us with some cheering words by Eugene Debs, who people were still voting for in the 1960s, since there was nothing else to vote for. But let me also end with a recommendation of this text, which Larry Shup's history, which I think is a model of historical investigation and arms us to deal with the future. Thank you.